The Queen Mary, a historic ship docked in Long Beach, California, hides dark secrets within its corridors. Built for luxury and used during World War II, it is no ordinary ocean liner. Reports of hauntings and paranormal events have turned it into one of the most haunted places in the world. Today, we'll follow Emily and Jack, two friends in search of a simple tourist adventure. But they'll soon discover something far more terrifying lurking in the shadows of this ship. Prepare to step into a place where the past and the supernatural meet, and where some souls have never left. The cool October wind blew lightly as Emily and Jack stepped out of the taxi and gazed up at the imposing silhouette of the Queen Mary. Once a symbol of luxury and power, the ocean liner now seemed shrouded in an aura of mystery. Docked in Long Beach, California, the ship had been transformed into a floating hotel, but stories from its days as a hospital during World War II and the tragedies surrounding it continued to draw curious visitors. Emily, a young woman with brown hair and bright eyes, sighed as she looked at the ship. She didn't believe in ghosts. To her, this visit would be a fun way to spend the night, an elaborate joke to entertain gullible tourists. Jack, her longtime friend, was the opposite. His eyes gleamed with excitement, eager to finally explore one of the most haunted places in the United States. "Are you ready to see the lady in white?" Jack teased, adjusting the camera in his hands. Emily rolled her eyes, crossing her arms to fend off the night's chill. "If I manage to get a good picture of the legend, we can sell it for millions." They headed toward the ship's entrance, where a small group of tourists had already gathered. A local guide, a calm-looking man wearing a faded Queen Mary uniform, waited patiently. He greeted everyone with an enigmatic smile and began recounting the ship's history. The Queen Mary had once served as a luxury ocean liner and, during the war, as a military hospital. Its opulent cabins and ornate corridors had witnessed countless lost lives and silent tragedies. Emily listened with a mix of skepticism and boredom as the guide explained that many areas of the ship, like the engine room and the pool, were frequent sites of apparitions. The tourists around murmured with interest, and Jack was already recording everything on video. As the tour began, the group was led through narrow, dimly lit hallways. The smell of salt water and rust lingered in the air. As they walked, Emily felt a strange cold draft pass directly through her, even though the space was enclosed. She ignored the chill that crept up her spine. "Wind on the ship. Of course," she muttered to herself, trying to shake off the unease. But as they moved forward, the sounds around them seemed to take on a life of their own. The faint sound of footsteps echoed through the corridors, even when everyone was standing still, causing some of the tourists to exchange nervous glances. Emily turned, expecting to see someone behind them, but the hallway was empty. She laughed nervously, unwilling to admit that something was bothering her. "Did you hear that?" Jack asked eagerly. Emily just shrugged, but something inside her was beginning to question what was happening. When they reached the first stop of the tour, the guide paused, looking at the group with a serious expression. "Welcome to the Queen Mary," he said in a somber tone. "From here, you may experience a bit of history and perhaps something more." Emily glanced around, the discomfort slowly rising. She couldn't explain it, but there was something about the ship's corridors that felt more alive than they should, and it was beginning to unsettle her. The group of tourists continued their walk through the narrow corridors of the Queen Mary, following the guide with hesitant steps. The atmosphere inside the ship was thick, almost oppressive. The dim lighting in the hallways accentuated the shadows on the aged walls, creating the impression that something or someone could be watching around every corner. Emily tried to maintain her skeptical stance, but the growing tension around her was palpable. She noticed the worried glances of the other tourists, especially when the guide mentioned the ship's most haunted locations. Even Jack, with all his excitement about the paranormal, was quieter than usual, as if he was expecting to see something at any moment through the lens of his camera. "This is the heart of the Queen Mary, the engine room," the guide announced as he stopped in front of a massive steel door. Here, during World War II, workers tragically died, crushed by the giant pistons as they tried to keep the ship running. It's said that to this day, their spirits remain trapped here, working eternally. Jack leaned forward, aiming his camera at the enormous, rusted metal machines. "Have you ever seen anything strange here?" he asked, clearly hoping for an answer that would fuel his insatiable curiosity. The guide gave a small smile. "Many times," he replied with a disturbingly calm tone. "Footsteps, voices, even shadows that seem to move between the machines. But be careful. The ship has its own way of dealing with unwanted visitors." The engine room had a strong metallic smell, mixed with damp and stale air. Emily crossed her arms and looked around, trying to ignore the strange sensation of being watched. It was as if the entire ship was alive, breathing silently. Suddenly, Jack stopped filming and quickly turned around, as if he had heard something. "Did you hear that?" he whispered, his eyes wide. Emily frowned, noticing for the first time the nervousness in Jack's voice. "Hear what?" she asked, trying to stay calm. "Footsteps, metallic footsteps, like someone is walking around here. But no one is behind us." Emily looked down the corridor they had come from. It was empty, except for the distant echo of their own movements. She shook her head, still reluctant to admit that something was wrong. "It's probably echoes. This place is huge, sound travels." The group moved forward, leaving the engine room and heading to one of the tour's most iconic locations, the ballroom. The guide continued his narrative, talking about the many gala events that had taken place there, but also about the apparitions that frequented the space long after the guests had left. One of the most famous legends was that of the Lady in White, a woman who had allegedly died on board and was said to still be seen dancing alone in the ballroom. "Some say she's trapped here, endlessly repeating her final moments," the guide said, leading the group into the ballroom. The ballroom was impressive, even in its current state of disuse. The large windows offered a breathtaking view of the sea, and the marble floor, though worn with time, still reflected the faint light from the old lamps. However, there was a strange stillness in the air, a silence that felt suffocating. Emily glanced around, curious. "Dancing with ghosts, is that it?" she whispered to Jack, trying to ease the rising tension with a joke. Before he could respond, she saw it. In the middle of the ballroom, right in front of her, a solitary figure was dancing in slow, graceful movements. A woman, wearing a flowing white dress, twirled delicately as if an inaudible song was playing in the background. Emily's heart stopped for a second. She blinked, expecting the vision to vanish, but the figure remained, each movement as clear as the rest of the ballroom around her. "Jack!" Emily whispered, tugging on his sleeve forcefully. "Are you seeing this?" Jack, who had been adjusting his camera, looked in her direction and froze. "Oh my God, it's her!" For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The rest of the group continued listening to the guide, unaware of what was happening. The lady in white twirled slowly, her almost translucent figure shimmering under the soft light. Emily felt a chill run down her spine, and her mouth went dry. She had never believed in ghosts, but what she was seeing in front of her was impossible to deny. Before she could react, the woman disappeared as suddenly as she had appeared, leaving the ballroom empty once again. Jack was still holding his camera, but he knew he hadn't captured the vision. Emily blinked several times, trying to regain her composure. The silence returned, broken only by the guide's monotonous voice, who seemed unaware that anything had happened. "Well, that was strange," she muttered, her heart still racing. She was beginning to understand that on the Queen Mary, the impossible could become very, very real. Emily couldn't shake the image of the woman in white who had just disappeared before her eyes. The ballroom now seemed darker, colder, as if the presence of that figure had drained all the energy from the room. Jack was speechless, staring at the spot where the apparition had been moments ago. The expression on his face wasn't one of fear, but of fascination. "You saw that, didn't you?" Jack asked, his voice raspy. "I knew something like this could happen, but it was so real." Emily took a step back, crossing her arms as she tried to steady her breathing. "Yes, I saw it. I don't know what it was, but that wasn't normal. That can't have been real. There has to be an explanation." Before they could continue discussing, the guide called the group to the next part of the tour. He seemed either unaware of Emily and Jack's agitation, or perhaps he was used to spooked visitors. The rest of the tourists followed him, unaware they had just missed one of the Queen Mary's most iconic experiences. "Now we'll head to the next stop," the guide said, motioning for the group to follow him out of the ballroom. "But remember, the Queen Mary has a peculiar way of making its guests feel at home, even those who never left." Emily and Jack followed the group, still silent. The corridor leading to the next part of the tour was long and narrow, with walls worn by time and moisture. Emily tried to rationalize what had happened. There was no way an apparition could be real, right? But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't convince herself that what she had seen was just her imagination. As the group moved down the corridor, the atmosphere grew heavier. The air felt dense, almost suffocating, and the dim lights flickered, as if the ship was responding to their presence. Emily, still trying to process what she had seen, began to feel a strange sensation that something was watching them from the shadows. "Do you think this happens with every group?" Jack asked, trying to break the uncomfortable silence. "I mean, the lady in white, does she always appear like that?" Emily didn't answer right away. She was still digesting the experience, and the tension in her body was evident. "I don't know, Jack. All I know is that it left me with a really strange feeling, and I don't like not being able to explain what happened." The guide led them to the entrance of one of the most famous and feared areas of the ship, the pool. Stopping in front of a large, rusted door, he turned to the group, his expression growing more serious than before. "This is the indoor pool. During the Queen Mary's time as a transatlantic liner, many people used this space for leisure. However, some of them never left. The temperature around them seemed to drop, and Emily found herself hugging her arms, as if trying to ward off the cold that wrapped around her. The guide continued, "One of the most famous stories about the pool is that of young Jackie. It's said that she drowned here, and to this day, she can be heard playing nearby. Many visitors report hearing children's laughter and seeing wet footprints on the floor, even though the pool is completely dry." The group exchanged uneasy glances as the guide opened the door with a prolonged creak. As they entered, the air felt even heavier. The room was completely dark, except for the faint lights reflecting off the tiled floor. The echo of their footsteps seemed to amplify the silence of the space, and Emily couldn't stop thinking about what the guide had just said. "Wet footprints," she whispered to Jack, trying to keep her tone casual, but her nerves were obvious. "That's what they say," Jack replied, his excitement returning as he aimed his camera at the surroundings. "Do you think we'll catch something?" "Keep your eyes peeled." As Jack filmed, Emily looked around, trying to shake off her discomfort. With each step, the cold seemed to intensify, and the feeling that something was watching them grew stronger. She tried to rationalize her thoughts again, but suddenly, a faint sound echoed through the space. Laughter, a soft, childlike laugh, reverberated through the walls of the abandoned pool. The laughter echoed through the darkened room, sending a chill down Emily's spine. She froze instantly, her eyes wide as she tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. Jack had heard it too, his excitement now mixed with a palpable fear. The guide, however, remained silent, watching the group as if waiting for their reactions. "Was that laughter?" Emily whispered, trying to hide the panic creeping into her voice. Jack, his eyes still glued to the camera screen, nodded slowly. "Yes, and it wasn't from any of us." The rest of the group began murmuring among themselves, looking around uneasily. The stories they'd heard about Jackie, the little girl who drowned in the pool, suddenly felt more real than ever. The atmosphere in the room was heavy, and Emily could feel the icy air filling her lungs, each breath harder than the last. As they stood there, uncertain of what to do next, Emily noticed something even stranger. Along the edge of the pool, faint footprints appeared on the ground. She stepped closer, making sure she wasn't imagining things. The footprints seemed fresh, as if a child had just run along the edge, leaving wet marks that trailed across the old tiles. "Jack, look at this," she said, pointing to the footprints. He lowered his camera, frowning as he saw what she was showing him. "That can't be. It's not possible. This pool has been closed for decades." The guide finally broke his silence, speaking in a calm, controlled voice. "Many say that Jackie still plays around here. Her laughter is often heard, and sometimes footprints appear, as if she's running around the pool, even when no one else is here." The atmosphere grew even heavier, and Emily felt her heart race. The wet footprints, visible just seconds ago, began to fade slowly, as if evaporating in the cold air of the room. It was impossible to ignore what was happening, and Emily struggled to hold on to her skepticism. But the events unfolding around her were defying logic at every turn. Suddenly, a chilling sensation swept through her body, like an icy hand had touched her shoulder. Emily froze, not daring to move, feeling the presence of something or someone standing right behind her. Her entire body reacted with a shiver, and for a moment, she thought she was losing control of the situation. "Emily, are you okay?" Jack asked, noticing the shock on her face. She opened her mouth to respond, but before she could say anything, the soft sound of footsteps echoed through the pool area. Small footsteps, like those of a child running, yet no one was there. The lights around them began to flicker, intensifying the eerie atmosphere. "Let's get out of here," Emily muttered, trying to keep her composure. Jack didn't need any further convincing. He grabbed his camera and started walking toward the exit, while the group, now in complete silence, followed the guide out of the pool area. The sound of Jackie's laughter seemed to echo in their minds, even after the heavy door slammed shut behind them with a loud thud. Emily took a deep breath, trying to steady her racing heart. For the first time that night, she had no rational explanation for what had just happened. Reality and the supernatural seemed to be blending in increasingly frightening ways aboard the Queen Mary. "I don't know what's happening here, but this isn't normal," she muttered to Jack as they hurried through the narrow ship corridors. Jack nodded silently, now clearly more serious. He knew that searching for the paranormal was dangerous, but nothing had prepared him for the intensity of what they were experiencing that night. And it seemed the Queen Mary still had more secrets to reveal. Emily and Jack hurried after the group as they left the pool, their minds still racing with the image of the footprints and Jackie's eerie laughter. Every corridor on the Queen Mary now felt tighter, more suffocating. The air was heavier, as if something was pressing them to leave. Despite the growing panic inside her, Emily kept telling herself that the tour would soon end, and they would return to the safety of solid ground. But that sense of safety quickly vanished when they reached the door leading to the main deck. The guide tried to open the heavy metal door, but it wouldn't budge. He frowned, giving it another try, but the door seemed locked in place. "What's happening?" one of the tourists asked, visibly nervous. The guide shook his head, perplexed. "This has never happened before. This door is never locked during tours." Emily exchanged a worried glance with Jack, while the other tourists began to murmur among themselves, their fear growing more evident. "There's another way out, right?" Emily asked, trying to keep her voice steady. "Of course, there are several," the guide said, though his expression suggested otherwise. "Let's try another route." The group followed the guide as he led them down a side corridor, but Emily's unease only deepened. The ship seemed darker than before, the hallways longer and more claustrophobic. With each turn, it felt like the environment was shifting, as if the Queen Mary was closing in on them. When they reached the next exit, things got worse. That door was also locked. The guide, now visibly agitated, began trying all the exits he knew, but one by one, they refused to open. The sound of footsteps echoed down the corridors, but there was no one behind them. This doesn't make sense," the guide muttered under his breath, more to himself than to anyone else. "These doors don't lock on their own." Jack was still filming everything, but his initial excitement had turned into something darker. "I think the ship doesn't want us to leave," he murmured. Emily's heart began to race. Something was definitely wrong. They were trapped inside the Queen Mary, a place that had already shown signs of being filled with forces beyond their understanding. The temperature continued to drop, and the sensation of being watched, which had started in the ballroom, was now almost unbearable. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice now filled with urgency. "I know," Jack replied, glancing around, searching for an alternative way out. "But it looks like we don't have a choice. Something is keeping us here." When the group returned to the starting point, their last hope of leaving the ship vanished. The main door, which should have led them back to the dock, was also blocked. The distant sound of chains dragging across the floor echoed through the hallways, as if the ship itself was alive, toying with their nerves. Emily turned to Jack, her eyes wide with fear. "We don't have much time. We need to figure something out." The Queen Mary, with all its secrets, wasn't going to let them leave so easily. The air was thick, heavy with tension and fear. Every step Emily took felt harder than the last, as if something invisible was holding them down. The entire group was restless, their voices mere whispers of confusion and panic. They were trapped, and the ship seemed to have no intention of letting them go. As Emily tried to think of a way to escape, a door at the end of the corridor creaked open. its eerie sound echoing through the silence. On the other side, the guide appeared, his expression strangely calm. He had stepped away from the group for a few moments, and now he seemed different. The fear that had crossed his face earlier had vanished, replaced by something Emily couldn't immediately recognize. "You need to listen to the ship," the guide said, his voice calm and controlled. "The Queen Mary is not just a place. It's an entity, filled with memories and presences that have never left. To leave here, you need to acknowledge that. You need to respect the spirits that still wander its halls." Emily took a hesitant step forward. "Respect them? How?" "You must understand," the guide continued, now looking directly at her. "These souls are trapped here, reliving the same moments of their lives and deaths. Many visitors tried to flee or confront them. That only makes things worse. You need to show them respect, to acknowledge their pain." The group fell silent, absorbing the guide's cryptic words. Jack glanced at Emily, doubt written on his face. "Do you think this will work?" he asked, his voice low. Emily shook her head, uncertain. "I don't know, but we don't have many options." With a heavy sigh, she approached the edge of a rusted railing, pulling from her pocket a small bracelet she always carried with her, a gift from her grandmother. It was the most personal item she had. "If this is what they need," she murmured, placing the bracelet on the ground as an offering. Other tourists followed suit, leaving small symbolic objects around, hoping this gesture would appease the unseen forces keeping them there. For a moment, everything was still. The tension that had filled the air seemed to slowly dissipate. The oppressive atmosphere began to lift, as if something had shifted around them. Cautiously, Jack stepped toward the door they had tried to open so many times. He grasped the handle, and this time it opened easily. Everyone held their breath, surprised but relieved. Emily exhaled shakily, still feeling the aftereffects of fear in her nerves. "I think it worked," she said, disbelief lacing her voice. The group began to move toward the exit, their steps quick and eager to finally leave the ship. However, a part of Emily knew that the Queen Mary still held its secrets. They were free, but the souls that inhabited the ship would remain there forever. The relief was palpable as Emily and Jack, along with the other tourists, stepped off the Queen Mary. The cool night air felt lighter, and the familiar sounds of the harbor were comforting after the intense atmosphere inside the ship. They walked in silence to the parking lot, still processing the supernatural events they had witnessed. Emily couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within her. The skeptic who had entered the Queen Mary was not the same person now leaving it. "I don't think I'll ever forget this night," Jack said, tucking his camera into his pocket. "I still can't believe we actually saw all of that." Emily looked at him, shaking her head slowly. "Neither can I. I didn't want to believe it, but after everything, it's impossible to deny. That place is more than just an old ship." The following days were a blur of confused memories and images she couldn't erase from her mind. Back in her apartment, Emily tried to return to her routine, but the events on the Queen Mary continued to haunt her. The idea that the ship was alive, filled with memories and souls trapped in its corridors, gnawed at her sanity. That night, while reviewing the photos Jack had taken during the tour, Emily came across something that made her heart race. One image, taken in the ballroom, showed the silhouette of a woman in a white dress, staring directly at the camera. It was her, the lady in white. Her eyes seemed to pierce through the screen, as if she were watching Emily, even from a distance. Emily snapped the laptop shut, a chill running down her spine. The Queen Mary might have been left behind, but the ghost she encountered there might never truly leave her.